Happy World Ocean Day. My name is Jennifer Cumbest and I work for the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Now that's a big title, so we like to lovingly call it the Grand Bay NER. But let's talk a little bit about what those mean. So national means we are actually a system all around the country. Estuarine, we're located on an estuary, and we'll talk a lot about what that is in just a second. System, okay, we are a research facility. That means we do a whole lot of science in our land and in our water, as well as a reserve, which means that the land and the water that we work with are protected through federal and state purposes. So earlier I said that we are a system. So this is a map, and there are actually 29 total reserves around the country, and we're continually adding to that number. So take a glance and see if you can find the one closest to you. There are about 5 located along the Gulf of Mexico. Mississippi is the one that I belong to, the Grand Bay NER. So let's talk a little bit about this system. Like I said, it is a national system. There are 29 of them around the country, and they were established in the Zone Act. And we are administered through NOAA. And that's just a really fancy way of saying that NOAA partners with us so that we get some of our funding, as well as the direction and the overall goal of the system is determined. I'm slightly biased, but I think they're a wonderful state partner. And they're responsible for the rest of the funding, as well as helping us determine our day-to-day running and what's best for our specific area as far as the funding. So let's talk a little bit more specific about where I get to work. So a couple more maps for you. Start with this one right here. So this is the entire state of Mississippi, and this is its coastal plain area, and we are in the very far southeast corner of the state. In fact, we are so far southeast that we actually share some of our land with the state of Alabama. So I don't know if you guys can see right here, but right there is actually the state line. And so some of the land that we help manage and some of the water that we help do research on is also a part of the state of Alabama. So we have a very big partnership because we're so closely located to them. So when NOAA established these reserves, there were kind of these 4 major goals that they wanted to achieve, and those 4 major sectors. So each reserve has to have these 4 sectors. And so I'm going to talk about each 4, their overall goal, what we do at Grand Bay to help achieve that goal.
Could you explain what NOAA is?
Yes, I'm sorry. NOAA is the National Oceanographic Atmospheric, and they are a huge federal agency that do all kinds of things. They were really helpful this past weekend when those storms came through. We watched, they provide a lot of weather data and things like that, as well as coastal management and things of that nature. So we're actually under the coastal management of NOAA, and that's where we get our partnership with them from. So continuing on, those 4 sectors I was talking about. So when we looked at, and when NOAA looked at how we want all these goals, they decided to separate it by these 4 sectors. And so pretty much every reserve has these 4 sectors. And let's start with the first one. The first one's going to be education, and that's my favorite, but that's because that's the one that I get to belong to. So at Grand Bay, what we do within our education department is I specifically get to go into schools through something that we call an on-the-road program. So I get to go hang out with kids, I get to go, and then I also get to bring kids to me. So I get to take them on kayak tours, I get to take them on boat tours, and essentially I just get to have fun with kids all day and teach them about science, which is like ultimate career goals. So that's why that's my favorite. Our second sector is another form of sector, or also known as the Coastal Training Program. And their goal is to educate, but their focus is not on students, but rather the people in the community that need our science in order to better do their job. So that could be mayors, elected officials, city planners, anybody that needs to know what's happening along the coast in order to better do their job. They also help provide trainings so that response teams know how to respond. So that's specifically something that our reserve is working on, and something that's really important right now as we reach hurricane season is we need to make sure that the people and the first responders in our area know what they need to do to properly care for not only the people impacted, but also the environment that get impacted by those storms. So those 2 sectors are what we like to call the education side of things. Their job is to help take the science that we're doing and interpret it so that the public within the community can better understand what's going on. So the other two sectors we refer to as kind of our science sectors, because that's their main focus. So we have our stewardship sector and we have our research sector. Now let's start with the research sector. Their goal is obviously to do research. That one's pretty self-explanatory. So within Grand Bay, some of the things that our research people are trying to do is they're doing fish monitoring. So they're going out in our marsh and they're taking samples and they're trying to figure out what species we have, how healthy those species are, and different things of that nature. They also do the same thing inland with different vegetation and weather data as well. Okay, and then we have our stewardship. We're referring to them as our natural resource managers. So their job is to help make sure that we are doing the best we can to protect the land and the water that have been put in our protection. And so one of the main ways that we do that at Grand Bay is through prescribed burns. So we normally burn about every 2 to 5 years. And one of the things that we do is our upland, which is our inland habitat, is a longleaf pine savanna. And written into the longleaf pine savanna ecology is the need for fire. So we have to make sure that we clear all that understory or the brush that lays at the base of the trees so that when those seeds release, they find nice clean soil to be able to germinate in. And so prescribed burning helps clear all that out and allows for those pines to rejuvenate and makes the ecosystem as healthy as possible. So one thing I want to talk about real quick before I move on, within these science sectors, both of them have a big hand in something called SWAMP, and that stands for System-Wide Monitoring Program. And this is something really, really important to the NER and all of the NER systems. So this is a setup that requires water quality data to be recorded every 15 minutes. So we have stations within our water, farther north and farther south within our water, and they take data every 15 minutes. So we continually understand what's happening within our water. So three kind of major things that we look at when we look at this water quality data. So we look at salinity, that just means how salty is the water. We look at temperature. Temperature plays a big role in the overall health of the ecosystem. So we want to know how that temperature is fluctuating. And then we can also look at dissolved oxygen. Obviously the living things within the water require that oxygen, so that's another really big health indicator for the ecosystem as a whole. And so those are just three very simple water quality things that we study. I promise we study a whole lot more, but it is way over my head. So those are the three major ones for SWAMP. And there's a resource page that will hopefully be accessible to you guys that has different ways to actually access that data. So one of the main reasons we take that data is to put it in the hands of the public. It's for you guys. It's so not only we know what's happening for our science, but so you can keep up to date and make sure that you know what's happening in your area as well. So that's all about the NERs and specifically what we do at Grand Bay. But the reason we are all part of a system is because there's one major thing we have in common. There's different goals within each reserve, different things we want to study, things of that nature. But the one thing that we all have in common is estuaries, called National Estuarine Research Reserves, because we're all located along estuaries. So now I know you're probably wondering, what is an actual estuary? So an estuary is very simply defined as where the river meets the sea. So essentially it's where we have all this fresh water from rivers meeting the salt water from our oceans. And they mix together and they create this special type of water called brackish water. And as you can imagine, different things within weather, tides, currents can all ultimately affect how that mixing happens. So we may have slightly saltier water or we may have slightly fresher water. And so the organisms, the plants, the animals, anything that calls an estuary home has to be super, super tough and what we call resilient. And that just means that they're capable of adjusting based on what's happening in the ecosystem. So that's what an estuary is, but why am I talking about estuaries on World Ocean Day? And believe it or not, even though estuaries have such a small percentage of our overall global ocean, they play a huge factor in the overall health of our ocean. And I'm going to tell you a couple reasons of why that is. So one of the main reasons is that estuaries act as nurseries. And that's just a really fancy way of saying that essentially young or babies or juvenile fish, ocean species use that estuary at some point in their life cycle. In fact, most estimate that about 75% of our commercial species, and that's just a way of saying any sort of ocean species that we as humans use for our benefit. So whether that's through food, whether that's through using it for products like menhaden or pogies, or anything of that nature, any ocean organism that we use for our benefit is considered a commercial species. So 75% of those species require or use the estuary for some part of their life cycle. So that's a lot of species, and that's really important to us. So we want to make sure that those estuaries are as healthy as they could possibly be, because it ultimately affects what ends up out in the open ocean, buffer zones. And that was really important to us here on Dauphin Island this past weekend because of the storm. So they act as this zone where they can actually handle the wave movement and things of, they also adjust to sea level rise and things of that nature as they migrate, and so they help soak in water, and so that allows for a buffer zone live along our estuaries. And so these oyster reefs actually allow for water that comes down the river to be filtered out before it actually reaches into our ocean. So that's just 3 reasons why estuaries are really important, and I have so many more. So the next thing I want to talk about is the percentage of population that live along the United States population lives along an estuary. So those people that live close to these ecosystems need to do all that they can to make sure that they're taking care of the habitats and the ecosystems around them. Whether that's taking time to pick up trash you accidentally dropped, or being mindful about how many plastic water bottles you use, or how you decide to get rid of the oil when you change the oil in your car. Very small, every day-to-day decisions can actually ultimately affect what happens in our estuaries, especially for those that live along the coastal area. Now let's talk about the other part of the population, the non-43%. You're probably asking, well, why do I need to care about estuaries? And that's because of something called a watershed. So this map right here is all the watersheds within the United States. And you can tell this nice big pink one right here is obviously the Mississippi River's watershed. And we're going to use it as an example just because it's the biggest and the easiest to see. But a watershed is all the area that ultimately drains and where it meets the ocean. So everything in this pink zone that you see will eventually meet the Gulf of Mexico. And so that's really important. So even these guys way up here in the north that may not be connected or close to any ocean actually have an effect on what comes out into the Gulf of Mexico. So we know and we see that estuaries are really important to the overall global health of our oceans, but even the people not living on these estuaries can drastically affect their health by what they put into their river systems, because ultimately all of that travels back and it will eventually meet the ocean. So even if you don't live on an estuary, I promise your day-to-day decisions affect our estuaries down here. So as much as I want to make sure that I'm protecting it, I also want to charge you guys with making sure that no matter where you live in the world, that you're being proactive about what you put into the ecosystem, because it all eventually does travel back down to the ocean. And we all know that where the ocean meets our rivers, we create these estuaries. And like I've been telling you guys, estuaries play a huge role in allowing the ocean to be as healthy as it can possibly be. So on World Oceans Day, I want you to think about those coastal areas and how your decisions can impact those coastal areas. And I want you to make better decisions in order to make sure that the health of our estuaries and therefore our global oceans is as best and as good as it can be. All right, I think that's it, guys. I hope you learned something. I hope you fell more in love with the ocean just like I did, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your World Oceans Day.